Please join me in praying that I don't say something we all regret. These are dangerous times. Mr. President, are you sure about this? It's not a coincidence that in the scriptures poverty is mentioned more than 2,100 times.
Look in my eyes, what do you see?
These issues are as alive as they ever were. Charity, it's about justice.
I know your anger, I know your dreams.
But justice and equality are mates, aren't they? Justice always wants to hang out with equality, and equality is a real pain in the ass.
I'm the smiling face on your TV.
I changed the channel.
Oh, there's a law of compensation. And there's an accounting to be held, an accounting that shall make the Depression of 1929 seem as a prosperity when it breaks upon.
Only you can set you free. The cult of personality.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Government should be afraid of their people.
You gave me fortune, you gave me fame, you gave me power in your God's name.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Indigenous Nightmare Podcast. I want to say for everybody, this episode is going to kind of be a special one because it's not regular to my schedule. But today I have Dr. Gerald Horne back. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. Today's conversation will be centered around Palestine and around American imperialism. So, first and foremost, I want to say thank you, Dr. Horne, for coming back. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. So I wanted to, if we could, because I mean, it would be kind of ignorant for us to not recognize this day, Martin Luther King Day. If you could speak just briefly on the importance of Martin Luther King and what this day means to not just regular people, but to also revolutionaries.
Well, I think that the MLK Day, and by the way, if I'm not mistaken, he would have been 95 today on his birthday if he had been able to survive an assassin's bullet on April 4th, 1968. I think that the King holiday marks a triumph over a certain stage of U.S. apartheid. And that is important because U.S. apartheid was an impediment to any kind of not only revolutionary activity, but radical or progressive activity. And number two, I think that the working class, and of course, Black people in particular, but not Black people exclusively, are an important component of the working class. Whenever we are able to get paid for not working, that is to say, have a paid holiday, that is a victory, because that is a step towards further redistribution of the wealth, this time from top to bottom. Oftentimes the United States is from bottom to top. And I think also, number three, that this holiday represents a victory of the peace forces, of the anti-war forces. Because, of course, Dr. King, in the latter stage of his life, was an adamant opponent of the U.S. war in Indochina and Vietnam in particular. So this is an important holiday that we should all mark.
Yes, I completely agree with you, and we can even also bring up, his stance on Palestine, and whatnot. But I think we could probably save that for another episode. I wanted to, if we can, just dove directly into one of the two topics that I had asked you to be a guest for today, which is Palestine and American imperialism. The first one being Palestine. We have seen in the last 101 days, 117 journalists killed, over 337 healthcare workers killed. We've seen hospitals bombed, churches, mosques. We've seen a total of over 23,968 martyred lives, all in the name of what would be Zionism. And so, if I could get your thoughts on currently right now, we have South Africa that is making a very compelling case against Israel for acts of genocide. Currently, if I could get your thoughts on that, and then also the current state of Gaza currently right now, as it stands 101 days into being bombarded by shellings, bombings, and all-out genocide.
Well, first of all, hats off to the government of South Africa for bringing a case pursuant to the Genocide Convention to the not the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, the World Court, so-called. This is a case that is dragging that the South Africans are dragging Israelis into the dock. The Israelis have signaled the importance of this case by sending one of their top jurists, Aharon Barak, 87 years old, survived the Holocaust in Lithuania, but has been an apologist for Israeli settler colonialism in historic Palestine. He is leading the Israeli team there. He has also been a mentor to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, by the way. South Africa, of course, their being able to bring this case also represents, number one, a vindication and a validation of those Jewish South Africans who were not favorable to Israel. I'm speaking of Joe Slovo of Lithuanian Jewish descent, who was the leader of the armed wing of the African National Congress, now in government. I'm speaking of his spouse, late spouse, Ruth First, also of Jewish descent, who died as a result of a letter bomb sent to her in Mozambique during the bad old days of apartheid. I'm speaking of Ronnie Kasrils, still in the land of the living, also of Jewish descent and part of the armed wing of the ANC. And I mentioned these comrades to begin with because Israel supposedly styles itself as a defender of Jewish people worldwide, and yet these Jewish folk in South Africa saw fit to oppose Israel because Israel collaborated with apartheid South Africa, just as U.S. imperialism collaborated with apartheid South Africa. Israel had nuclear collaboration with apartheid South Africa, for example. I should also say that this case brought in the ICJ represents a change in the global correlation of forces. That is to say that it would have been unimaginable a few decades ago that South Africa would have the gumption and the moxie to drag Israel into the dock. But given the fact that U.S. imperialism is in precipitous decline, hardly able to call the shots, this has led to a new international situation, dare I say a new world order, represented by the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and the precipitous decline of U.S. imperialism. And so this is a very important case. It's an important case as well, because if you study Israel, as some of us have done, you will find it not to be coincidental that some of the most hawkish forces in Israel happen to have roots in the United States of America. I'm speaking of the 800,000 settlers illegally implanted on Palestinian territory on the West Bank of the Jordan River. Many of them, have, to be more precise, have roots in Brooklyn, New York. I've been monitoring Israeli media, for example, and you may also want to watch the show of Caroline Glick, who makes the Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher seem like a cotton puff by way of comparison. She speaks with a thick U.S. accent. Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, spent a good deal of his youth in both Pennsylvania and in New England. And so people of the United States, for more reasons than one, have a stake in this conflict because so many of the folks who are engaging in a genocide in Gaza are reenacting what happened in North America in the 19th century, except on steroids. That is to say, that it's not coincidental that many of these hawkish figures have U.S. accents, and it's not accidental as well that U.S. imperialism is a major backer of Israeli genocide, because it has been said by U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and White House spokesman John Kirby that the South African case is without merit, without foundation. But I think what they're worried about, number one, is that if Israel can be dragged into the dock for violating the Genocide Convention, why not the United States? After all, it was in 1950 that the late, great Paul Robeson, the Black American activist, socialist, performer, artist, led a petition campaign to do precisely that. And for his troubles, his passport was snatched. There was an attempt to kill him, quite frankly. And the United States has to be concerned that the idea that the United States can be dragged into the International Court of Justice because of spiraling infant mortality rates with regard to Black infants, the fact that disproportionate numbers of Black women die in childbirth, police terror, the death penalty disproportionately inflicted on Black people. So the United States has to be concerned. And then, of course, it has to be concerned that if South Africa can drag Israel into the dock and get an injunction or cease and desist order calling for a ceasefire, and that even if the United Nations Security Council decides per the United States to veto this ICJ mandate, it can still go to the General Assembly. And my understanding is that the General Assembly can then recommend further sanctions against Israel, and perhaps even sanctions against the aiders and abettors of Israel, which would include U.S. imperialism in the first instance. With regard to the heart of the case, the South Africans pointed to reproductive violence. That is to say, you have Palestinian women in Gaza dying in childbirth. The infant mortality rates make those of Black Americans seem minor by comparison. You see hunger stalking the land. In fact, the United Nations suggested that about 80% of the worst cases of starvation worldwide are centered in Gaza, which only has a population of 2 or 2.2 million on a territory that's hardly larger than the island of Manhattan. If you look at disease that's spreading like wildfire, not least because of contaminated water, Gaza is a human rights catastrophe, and we should only salute South Africa for recognizing this fact.
Yes, yes, and during these hearings, Israel's side consistently made the case that the courts were being biased. Now, I feel like if this was in the United Nations, that easily could be said for the Palestinians, is that you are being biased towards Palestinians. You are siding with Zionism. So I find that to be very, very humorous, because this whole entire time Israel has gotten away with the most atrocious crimes you could possibly imagine, and has been given the tools by the U.S. To inflict genocide and terror onto Palestinian people. And I created a Substack article that basically outlined how this is very similar to Blitzkrieg of Europe, the bombardment of Gazan homes, of Palestinian lives. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on the fact that even though the ICJ has ruled this to be acts of genocide, at least on South Africa's part, creating the evidence, there's now a link for any civilian that's out there that has any evidence to prove that Israel has caused genocide in Gaza, for people to submit their claims as well. My next question, would be what is the outcome if the court does side with South Africa. A lot of countries are right now, like Canada, are condemning the ICJ and calling it anti-Semitism, which I find that to be funny. Calling basically for the ICJ to quit this case, to quit these trials. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on, if this does go through, what does that look like for Palestinians? Because currently, right now, they are not getting or receiving any humanitarian aid, and the little humanitarian aid that they do receive, IOF is strictly banning or making it very hard for any aid to come in. So I'd like to get your thoughts on, what would be the outcome of if South Africa succeeds with claiming the genocide, the acts of genocide that we all know are going on right now. What would be the end result of that?
Well, you may have noticed that a moment or two ago, I outlined a scenario whereby the International Court of Justice issues what amounts to a cease and desist order, calling for a ceasefire, which we are demanding on this side of the Atlantic. If Israel chooses to ignore the ICJ opinion, then it can be taken up in the Security Council, where it presumably face a veto from the United States, one of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, all 5 permanent members having veto power. And then you might recall I suggested that it perhaps could go to the General Assembly, where a different action could be taken. But rather than getting ensnared in technicalities and legalities, we should look at the political question. And that is that the South Africans have been supported by Cuba, by Turkey, by a number of other countries, and that this could form the basis for multilateral or bilateral sanctions against Israel. You see that the Ansar Allah in Yemen, oftentimes referred to on this side of the Atlantic as the Houthis, they imposed the kind of sanctions on Israel by going after ships that were sailing through the Red Sea to the Suez Canal, to the Israeli port of Eilat, seeking to destabilize, shall we say euphemistically, those ships, which in turn has led to a U.S. attack on Yemen, backed by the United Kingdom and a number of other U.S. henchmen. This will not end well for U.S. imperialism. Recall that before this dastardly episode of attacks on Yemen, the United States had sponsored a lengthy war on Yemen by their neighbor in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have reason to respect the martial and fighting abilities of the Yemenis, which is what led them to withdraw with their tail between their legs from this conflict some months ago, which then set the stage for the Saudis to engage in an entente with Iran, brokered by China. Recall that Iran and Ansar Allah are considered to be comrades, although to say that Iran and Ansar Allah are 2 peas in a pod is probably a bridge too far. So I dare say that irrespective of what happens with regard to the technicalities and legalities, Israel finds itself in a major crisis because the south of the country has been abandoned because of what happened on October 7th. The north of the country is increasingly abandoned because of the conflict with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Israel is heavily dependent upon U.S. imperialism, but then you saw in Washington, D.C., just this past weekend, a demonstration of thousands of U.S. nationals calling for a ceasefire, replicated in other capitals, including London. So the political question is what we need to fixate on, and we need to place the ICJ petition in the context of this political situation.
Thank you. And, I had Dr. Cornel West on a couple of months ago, literally October 6th. It was the day before the Alaska flood had happened, before I'm going to say, before my comrades, my Palestinian comrades, enacted their right to self-defense and self-determination. Um, he gave a couple weeks after, he gave a kind of, I'm going to condemn Hamas the same way, or looking at it in a way where, I would condemn Nat Turner for his actions the same way that I would condemn Hamas. So I'd like to get your thoughts on, Dr. West basically stating, that he would condemn Nat Turner for initially invoking his natural right to defend himself against slavery. Now, I know you have wrote many books pertaining to slavery, pertaining to America and its occupation. So I'd like to get your thoughts on Dr. West's comments pertaining to basically stating that he will condemn Hamas for anything that they do, when Hamas is inevitably fighting for their right to freedom and liberation.
Well, as you may know, I have tremendous respect for Dr. West. I've been supportive of his effort to wind up in the White House by January 2025. On this, I think that we part ways. Although I should say that if you studied the ICJ presentation by South Africa, they were critical as well of what Hamas did on October 7th. Their point of view was that even a people under occupation have the right to resist, but their point of view was that their right to resist has certain boundaries and certain limits. And I assume that that was the position of Professor West as well. As for myself, once again, I don't necessarily share the point of view of the South Africans. Certainly, I do not share the point of view that would be critical or hostile to slave rebels in Dixie, such as Nat Turner, for example, such as the others who followed in his wake and that preceded him, because I would be critical of the systems that place people in these sorts of difficult situations. The systems of racism, the system of Jewish chauvinism and Jewish xenophobia, and creating an open air prison in Gaza, and enacting a system of apartheid against the people of the West Bank. That is where I would direct my outrage and my criticism.
Okay. And I think me and you kind of are on the same footing, when it comes to October 7th. I feel maybe we're not, but to kind of get into U.S. imperialism, or before we get into that, I wanted to say that, I seen that Namibia condemned Germany for standing in solidarity with Israel and claiming anti-Semitism. Not that I want to get your thoughts on that, but I feel like this has a big deal to do with the U.S. dollar and Europe kind of not really having any base claims to legitimize Israel anymore, due to the fact that we are seeing on a day-to-day basis video after video, journalist after journalist being martyred or being put in situations of death or on the brink of death. And so I'd like to gravitate this conversation to, if we can, U.S. American imperialism and how right now we are seeing a mass of very, very, very mass movement of decolonization, whether it be in South Africa, Burkina Faso, Niger, whether that be in the Philippines, whether that be in West Papua, whether that be here, where we are actively seeing individuals from the ages of anywhere from 18 to 35 years old that are out there marching and protesting for the end of U.S. occupations across the globe and the end of U.S. imperialism. So I'd like to get, your thoughts on how in the last year and a half, we've seen a huge flux across the globe of individuals that are openly and avidly pointing the finger at the U.S. For creating catastrophes across the globe.
Well, first of all, with regard to Namibia, formerly German Southwest Africa, you may recall that between 1904 and about 1908, Berlin executed what has been characterized as the first genocide of the 20th century against the Nama and Herero people. Namibia came to independence about 1990, and since that time, the independent government has been pressing Berlin for reparations, which Berlin has steadfastly refused to accede to this just demand, despite the fact that Israel, which was not in existence when the Holocaust took place between the early 1930s and 1945, has been accorded reparations by Berlin. And in fact, Berlin has become one of the sturdiest allies of Israel. In fact, Berlin has sought to intervene in the ICJ case and make an argument on behalf of the Israeli war criminals. And it's very curious that the predecessor regime in Berlin, an ethno-nationalist regime, to put it mildly, is now seeking to intervene on behalf of an ethno-nationalist regime in Israel. This is curious at best, and you should pay attention to the rumors coming out of Berlin that Chancellor Scholz might be forced out of office. Now, if he's forced out of office, it will be for many reasons. His ham-fisted policies towards Ukraine and Russia, his ham-fisted policies towards German agriculturalists, but I dare say that his policies towards Israel and Palestine are not winning him any favors amongst the German electorate as well. And I should also say, as you've indicated, that anti-colonialism is the order of the day. Now, many of us have thought that the era of anti-colonialism was something that was in the rearview mirror. We thought that 1960 was the year of Africa, for example, if not 1960, 1963, that with 1994, South African independence, that puts paid to the era of colonialism and neocolonialism. But even in Africa itself, you still have Western Sahara improperly and illicitly occupied by Morocco, a close ally of U.S. imperialism, and in fact, a signatory to the ill-fated, ill-advised Abraham Accords negotiated by the Trump team, which sought to deliver a kind of legitimacy to Israel by bringing Arab neighbors into the fold to recognize Israel, Morocco being part of that ill-famed group. And so we also see that France, which has been a major neo-colonial vampire in Africa, has been suffering blow after blow. And it's not only on the neo-colonial front with regard to the aforementioned Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso, Guinea-Conakry to a degree, Gabon to a degree, but also if you pay attention to the itinerary of President Macron, you will have noticed his trips to the South Pacific, to New Caledonia, nickel rich. Nickel, of course, is an important mineral for the green economy. It's very striking if you look at the history of New Caledonia, this French colony, that after the abortive Paris Commune about 160 odd years ago, which was a precursor to the 20th century struggle for socialism, that many of the combatants were deported to New Caledonia, of all places. And therefore, you have this settler population in New Caledonia that, ironically, these descendants of the Paris communards, many of them are not necessarily standing by the independence cry of the indigenous people of New Caledonia. But I dare say that their failure to stand by independence will be adjudged by historians of a progressive hue as a blunder and a mistake, because, again, anti-colonialism is the order of the day.
Yeah, as you said, anti-colonialism is the order of the day. We're currently avidly seeing across the globe people even tuning into your books, using your books as a basis for understanding anti-colonialism, understanding slavery, understanding settler colonialism. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on, in the last, I would have to say 3 to 4 years, we've seen a mass influx of individuals that have respected you and your works, and are currently using that now as a basis um, to give their claims of genocide that are going on in Palestine, going on in the Congo, and using it as a form of theory. So basically implementing you into like a book list of individuals to read before you go and try and make an argument about something. You must read Gerald Horne's work. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on that, because I am an individual that does exhibit that. I do tell people, a main focal point of my understanding is reading books that were written by Gerald Horne and by a plethora of other individuals like Ben Madley. These are Kyle T. Mays. These are two individuals that you introduced me to the last time that you were on, and I was very, very fortunate to read both of their books, one of which was a very long one, American Genocide by Ben Madley, but it brings a lot of history and knowledge to it. So I'd like to get your thoughts on individuals that openly and avidly say, hey, you cannot really have an opinion on something unless you've read this certain amount of criteria, one of which is your books. The Dawning of the Apocalypse is something that I recommend a lot of people to read before they go and try and even have try and give an opinion on something. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, let's start with the Dawning of the Apocalypse, because I think that book, even though it deals with the 16th century, and in fact reels back to the end of the 13th century, sheds light on what's going on today, believe it or not. Because this book deals with how and why it is that so many of us are in North America speaking English, a language of Northwestern Europe, when this was hardly envisioned a few hundred years ago. What I mean is that Spain, Catholic Spain, had a first mover's advantage insofar as they sponsored the freebooter Christopher Columbus in 1492. But by 1517, you had the secession from the Catholic Church, spearheaded by Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, by the way, which led to the so-called Protestant Reformation. The Protestant sect, a sect of Christianity, spread like wildfire into England, adopted by the king, which then sets off a round robin of religious conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, between the Protestant powers, principally England and the Netherlands, and the Catholic powers, principally Spain and Portugal. The latter outnumbered the former by several orders of magnitude. And so in order to survive, you saw that the Protestant powers had to make compromises. One compromise they made was with the Jewish population. That is to say, London had expelled this Jewish population at the end of the 13th century, but by the end of the 1500s, it was literally under the gun. It was barely able to avoid being overthrown by invading Spaniards in 1588. So they made the historic compromise, invited the Jewish diaspora into the tent, and that particular trait was then passed on to their colonists and settlers in North America. So you see that even after the overthrow of British rule in 1776 to say 1783, that this entente with the Jewish diaspora continued. And it was particularly important for the settlers here in North America, because one of the mistakes our radical so-called ancestors have made is that they looked at the Jewish community of Europe and saw how that they were suffering, persecuted. And then they looked at the Jewish community of North America and saw how the persecution was much less. And they came to the conclusion that the United States must be more progressive than Europe. But since they didn't have a conception of settler colonialism and didn't have a conception of white supremacy, that is to say that the settlers here in North America needed every warm European body they could muster in order to subdue the Native Americans, keep the Africans in line. And so therefore they made a deal with the Jewish diaspora. Now, what's interesting about that as well is that if you look at the writings of these settlers in the 18th century, when they were talking about a First Amendment with regard to religious freedom, they put it in the context of needing more European settlers. Not necessarily in terms of some sort of Enlightenment idea that we're more progressive than Europe. Just like if you look at the Second Amendment with regard to the right to bear arms, they made it clear that they wanted settlers to be armed so that they could shoot Native Americans and shoot Africans. And of course, there was no Second Amendment for Black people in late 18th century, early 19th century. A strategic objective of the settlers was to keep arms out of the hands of the Native Americans. Even if you go back and look at Westerns, this genre of Hollywood movies, oftentimes there's a plot twist about some diabolical settler who's selling arms to Native Americans, and you're supposed to boo and hiss as a direct result. And so you see this entente between the Jewish diaspora and the United States. There are bumps in the road, for example, but we have to acknowledge that many Jewish people were able to reach extraordinary heights. I'm thinking of David Yulee. I don't know, are you a pro football fan?
Sorry about that. I'm a Bengals fan.
Okay, so you know about the Tennessee Titans, right?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
You're familiar with their running back, Derrick Henry?
Yes, I am.
He's from Yulee, Florida, Yulee. David Yulee was of Jewish ancestry, was one of the leaders of Florida, one of the leaders in the depredations inflicted upon the indigenous of Florida. Recall that there was a de facto alliance between the people we call the Seminoles and the Blacks of Florida, which was quite harmful to the interests of the settlers. That's one of the reasons why David Yulee was elected to high office, even though he happened to be Jewish. Judah Benjamin was a leader of the Confederate States of America, which of course rebelled against the United States in order to perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore. He happened to be Jewish as well. Now, of course, there are bumps in the road. You might recall the Leo Frank case about a century or so ago in Georgia, when a Jewish man is lynched based upon a blood libel. Interestingly enough, the Israeli authorities are cheapening that serious phrase by saying that South Africa is engaged in a blood libel by dragging Israel into the dock at The Hague. Blood libel was this European canard that Jewish folk killed Christians to drink their blood. So Leo Frank was lynched because of blood libel in Georgia. Interestingly enough, and this is a tip to our scholars in the audience, we really need a new history of the Leo Frank case, because the current histories do not point to something that's quite curious, which is that the Frank defense tried to blame the killing of the Christian girl, Mary Fagan, on the Black janitor. But that defense was not accepted, interestingly enough. And Leo Frank was lynched. We need a story, a new history that takes that into account. But that then brings us, of course, to the end of World War I. And Turkey, which had been the occupying power in historic Palestine, is on the losing end of World War I. Britain is on the winning end. They cut a deal with the Jewish diaspora with the Balfour Declaration, promising a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine, although, of course, Zionism, which arises at the end of the 19th century under the leadership of Theodore Herzl, Herzl, not only had the historic Palestine as a possible Jewish homeland, but they looked at Africa, they looked at Madagascar, Uganda, etc. But in any case, that leads to an influx of the Jewish diaspora into historic Palestine, setting off conflict with the Arab population. Nonetheless, as a result of the Holocaust, there's quite a bit of sympathy for the Jewish population in Europe in particular. And so the United Nations votes 1947, 1948, that there should be two states, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. The former does not come into existence for various reasons. And that leads to the present crisis that we're now facing. U.S., of course, was one of the first states to recognize Israel. And once again, you cannot understand that, nor understand why the United States continues to wield its veto in the Security Council on behalf of Israel without understanding this long-standing, centuries-long relationship between the Jewish diaspora and settler colonialism under first the British flag and then the U.S. flag.
Yeah, and I believe out of the 88 times that the U.S. has used the veto, it has been 56 of times they've used it for an advocacy of Israel or an advocacy of genocide. And that's I actually just read that. I want to say a couple hours ago before we got on. So I'm glad that that I was able to put that in this episode. I don't necessarily know if you really answered the question to how you feel that your work is consistently being brought up in a positive manner. No, it's not. It's with all the history that you do give. I do see where that might have gotten lost. So I do appreciate you you giving that. But if you could, you are a person who I deeply admire as a scholar, as an elder. Who brings a lot, to the table. So I'd like to get your thoughts on, just the mass positivity that you get from across this occupation, across the globe, from an international level, how your work is being used to propel the right idea of anti-colonialism and standing in solidarity with the people who we should be standing in solidarity with, which is the people who are subjugated by this white hegemonic mode that is U.S. American imperialism.
Well, I'm happy to say, and I just happen to have this book to my left, that my book on Texas, the counter-revolution of 1836, Texas slavery and Jim Crow, and the roots of U.S. fascism. It's a book that diverges from the traditional heroic narrative of the creation of the United States, which, as you know, even people on the left subscribe to this narrative. As a matter of fact, many people on the left are upset with me because I don't subscribe to this narrative. Yeah, but I'm happy to say, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, the last time that we talked, I was associated with a group of individuals, some of which I still kind of am. But one thing that ruffled my feathers and kind of made me a little irritated was that someone said that they were a comrade of someone who blatantly disrespected you as a scholar, as an elder. And I want to say first and foremost that I am not associated with anybody who has any type of beef with you, because any beef with you means they have beef with me. They have beef with the right people. So I just wanted to point that out there, is that I do know and I am aware of individuals that critique your work in a very ignorant way, and obviously show in many instances that they have not read your work. And if they have read your work, it's more or less a couple sentences and then became sciolists of the book. And so I just wanted to put that in there.
Well, I was mentioning that I just got an email this morning. This book is being translated in Cuba into Spanish.
Wow.
So
wow. Congratulations.
The Cubans also translated my book on Cuba into Spanish, Race to Revolution, the United States and Cuba during slavery and Jim Crow. But I should also mention that part of the problem in the United States is that there's an attempt to homogenize the history of various peoples. Now, for example, the Black population was part of the unpaid sector of the working class. The unpaid sector of the working class, we've known this for decades, if not centuries, that in 1776, the unpaid sector of the working class did not side with George Washington. That would have been class collaboration. We also know that class collaboration has been the ethos of settler colonialism. In my 16th century book, I talk about the first incursion of the English into what they called North Carolina in the 1580s. It was a motley crew of Europeans from various class backgrounds, shopkeepers, workers, D-class elements, lumpen elements, all sponsored by the 1% in London, and all having a common interest in denuding the Native Americans of their land, and with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, they could then become enslavers of Africans and become fabulously wealthy and execute the so-called American dream. And so we also know that the African population did not side with the rebels in 1776. That's one of the reasons we're still being treated so harshly today. We also know that in 1812, when there was another war between Britain and the United States, that the African population, I talk about this in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown. That's really how the book begins. August 1814, the Africans in Washington, D.C. joined with the Redcoats in burning down the city, sending President Madison and his spouse fleeing to the streets. Then they all flee to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. In fact, I was speaking on that book about a decade ago in New York City, and some of the Black people who were there were descendants of the Black people who had fled to Trinidad and Tobago. So it's not just Britain. Of course, we know that with regard to Texas seceding from Mexico, that obviously the Black people in Texas did not agree with the secession, since the enslavers were upset with Mexico because Mexico had moved to abolish slavery under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero. And so once again, the interests of the unpaid sector of the working class did not necessarily correspond to the interests of Washington. This continued to the 20th century with folks like Robeson and Du Bois being pro-Moscow. Even the Black nationalists, who I've had certain disagreements with, they were all pro-Japan during World War II. In fact, my book, Race War, has been translated into Japanese, which deals with, just so you can see anybody can read Japanese might want to look at that. Hope I'm.
Yeah, I seen the back of it. There it is, right there. There it is.
Because I mean, it's just like the Palestinians. I mean, when people are oppressed, so you ask the Palestinians, well, you shouldn't side with Ansar Allah because they're Islamists. Well, the people of Palestine, they're trying to get any help that they can muster to get that Israeli boot off of their neck. And it's likewise, progressive people, you would think the progressive people would be in favor of slave revolts, for example. You would hope. But as I said, once it comes to slave revolts in North America against the settlers, that's where they draw the line. Speaking of which, my book, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Now, Washington, D.C. was a key city because that's the capital. And that's, once again, recall what I said about 1814, trying to overthrow the U.S. government with the Negroes in the vanguard. This continues in the 20th century. That leads, of course, to what I call the Compromise of 1954, whereby in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions, anti-U.S. apartheid concessions, you see that the trade-off is the decapitation of the Black radical leadership, led by people like Ben Davis, who the communist councilman from Harlem, who, of course, was a comrade of Martin Luther King Jr. In this book, I talk about how Martin Luther King Jr., there was an attempted assassination of him in 1958 in Harlem. A woman stabbed him in the chest. He barely survived. Rushing to the hospital was Ben Davis, who gives him a blood transfusion, leading to the FBI saying that Martin Luther King has communist blood in his veins, for example. So this, I mean, I could go on in this vein. It seems a little self-serving just to talk about my work. So perhaps I should talk about other work that I've learned from, including the work of the late Trinidadian scholar Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, the work of the late Trinidadian intellectual C.L.R. James, the Black Jacobins. Of course, my book on the Haitian Revolution, and that's the topic of James's book, is a kind of sequel to James's book. My book is entitled Confronting Black Jacobins. The late Guyanese scholar Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. To go back to the classics, I would recommend the book by Marxist comrade Engels, Engels, The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. In a book that I'm publishing this summer, it's my next book, Armed Struggle with a question mark. Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. I have a vignette in that book because that book, I was in California during that era. And there's a vignette in that book where I was teaching at this prison in California, where they used to house a lot of the Panthers. And one of my students was a man by the name of Donald DeFreeze, who winds up kidnapping the heiress, Patty Hearst, supposedly flipping her into becoming a bank robber. You can still find the video of her robbing a bank in California. She says that she was coerced, but I'll leave that for another discussion. In any case, he was killed in a shootout in LA. I think it was in 74, 75. But in any event, when he was my pupil in Vacaville State Prison, I lent him a copy of my book by Engels, The Origins of Family, Private Property, and the State. I never got the book back, needless to say. One of the reasons why I'm hesitant to lend books to this very day. But in any case, that book is still worth reading. But I would say this too, and I would say this particularly to some of our friends on the left. Like I point to Engels as a book, his book on the family, private property, and the state being worth reading. But there have been progressions since Engels, needless to say. And I think part of the problem with some of our friends on the left is that they're like biologists who only want to rely on Darwin and don't want to acknowledge DNA because Darwin didn't come up with DNA, for example. Yeah. We have to realize that supposedly we're dealing with a science of society. And science is not static. It moves forward. And either you move forward or you fall behind, which brings me to one of the criticisms I'm making in my next book of the Panthers, which is that I think that they were very good with regard to studying the classics. Mm-hmm. Donald DeFreeze, or Cinque, as he called himself, reading Engels. But you not only have to read the classics, which of course you must do, you also got to keep up with the news. And because the classic, that's the skeleton, that's the framework. What's happening on a day-to-day basis, that's the flesh. And that's what you have to interpret by dint of your framework. And they didn't do a very good job of keeping up with the news. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're no longer with us. So that's my tip to revolutionaries, budding or otherwise, in your audience. You got to keep up with the news. You got to keep up with the developments in Palestine and China, Japan, Brazil, United States, Canada, South Africa, Nigeria. The list is long. And obviously that's a formidable task, which is one of the reasons why people join collectives, so that they can share intelligence collectively.
Yeah, and you kind of said something that I was already thinking, is that, as much as we should be relying on Marx, Engels, Lenin, like how you said there, and you gave a very good example, is that they are the skeletons. That is the bar minimum. There are individuals like Walter Rodney, W.E. Du Bois. I could even throw in there Huey P. Newton, the likes of Sylvia Winters, Angela Davis. All of these individuals compounded that work of Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, compounded that into their works and gave us a broader understanding. George Jackson, not to leave him out by any means. These individuals took what Marx and Engels and Lenin stated, and they formulated their own thesis and understanding, which is why we have like a Walter Rodney that created a decolonial Marxism, which is something that I follow. And when he said, in grounding with my brothers, they can give you a car, they can give you a good income, they can give you a nice place to live, but at what expense? Your black soul. And so, when we look at at individuals like Walter Rodney, I hold them to a more higher degree than I do an Engels or a Marx, simply because they actually formulated the work into thesis. And so I will always be forever grateful to them, just as much as I am grateful to you for exhibiting the 40 plus books I believe that you've written that have been in solidarity with liberation and getting people to understand that. I know that we got about 6 minutes left, so there are some questions that I wanted to ask regarding any potential. I know that the how this episode was formulated, or at least how I got in contact with you, back in contact with you, was a forwarded flyer for an event that I believe is happening on the 16th or the 19th. I'm not too sure. I'm hoping maybe that you could give some kind of understanding as to what the next month looks for you as far as books. I think someone wrote a book about you. I'm not too sure, so maybe you can kind of clear that up. But yeah, the last 5 minutes now. What are some things that you have kind of cooked up, for this new year that are aligned with liberation, revolutionary, radical thought and theory?
Well, this Thursday, you can go to my Facebook page, by the way,
Yeah.
and get the details. I'm speaking at this webinar on the Black freedom struggle and Palestine. I'm speaking for about 20 minutes on Thursday, January 18th, 7 p.m. When is this program going up?
This will be up today. I will have this up today. Yeah. So
and then Saturday morning, 9 a.m. Central, I'm addressing Philadelphia school teachers on a webinar. That's on my webpage too, but anybody can sign up on 1776 and its discontents. Now, you might have noticed that I've spoken to both of those questions thus far in our discussion. Yeah. And then on Friday, January 26th at 6:30 p.m. Central, I'm speaking another webinar on the Cuban Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. Details on my Facebook page. On Saturday, January 27th, is an international webinar. This guy from Paris has organized it. And I'm speaking once again on the Black freedom struggle and Palestine, although there will be an audience from Paris and Vienna and Johannesburg and elsewhere. And once again, I plan to take off my hat to the South African government for having the moxie and the gumption to drag the Israelis into the dock. I mean, that's a profound significance that cannot be underestimated. And then for those in the Southland, in Southern California, I'm speaking in person, not on Zoom or some other platform, in Africatown, Leimert Park, Los Angeles, February 3rd, 1 to 3. You can find the details either at kpfk.org. It's a benefit for the progressive radio station KPFK in Los Angeles. And also, I do this program on KPFK, Freedom Now, which is broadcast 11 a.m. Saturday. You can find all the interviews online. And last Saturday, in fact, I gave a sneak preview of that book on Southern California that I've just sketched. One involves Cinque and the Panthers, and actually some of the people you've mentioned. In my book will be the fullest exploration in print thus far of what happened with George Jackson and Angela Davis, for example.
Yeah, the ties between them. Yeah.
In terms of the so-called shootout in the courthouse north of San Francisco, August 7th, 1970, Angela Davis going underground. Then the trial, the killing of George Jackson, August 1971, the mysterious circumstances leading to prison revolts, not least in Attica, upstate New York, September of 1971. So then I should, since I'm just talking about some of this work, my next book will be out next year. It's on slavery in Washington, D.C.
Yes, I remember the last time we spoke, you were telling me that you were just barely getting to that. Yeah. That was actually almost about a year ago. So I'm pretty sure it's almost finished now.
Yeah. I got to do some research because I plan to continue this theme of what happened in August 1814 with the Negroes seeking to overthrow the U.S. government in conjunction with the Redcoats. And then in about 5 weeks, I'll be in Hawaii. Hawaii has the best resources of any indigenous population under the U.S. flag, but I mean, an archive, because the Hawaiian Kingdom was very influential. That's why the United States government overthrew it. I talked about
Yeah,
that
they,
in
yeah.
the White
They
Pacific.
created their own. They had created their own mocks for submarines before submarines were even thought of. The
They had
Hawaiian Islands.
electricity and telephones before
Yeah.
the U.S. mainland did,
Yeah.
and it was considered to be the back door to invade the United States, and so that's why they overthrew the government in the 1890s. Anyway, so I'm doing a book entitled "The Roots of U.S. Imperialism," which thus far, well, I won't go into all this, but it's going to be Hawaii is going to be the key to my exploring the roots of U.S. imperialism. Let's just leave it as that.
I can't wait. I can't wait for these books to come out, for me to get even just a little taste of it. I know you said that you're going to be in Southern California in February. Hopefully by then, if it's a in-person attendance where people can watch you in person, I probably will be one of the ones that will be in attendance if I can
Oh,
get
you're
out there.
going to fly to L.A.?
Yeah, I'm hoping that I can not fly because I currently reside in Las Vegas right now.
Oh, I see.
But
You
I
can
am.
drive.
But yeah, so I could initially take a Greyhound bus if I want to if I wanted to be cheap like that. I could take a Greyhound to go and see Dr. Horne. Give your thought and your theory out there. But yeah, I do wish I could get my hands on these books before anybody else, but I know I'm gonna have to wait like everybody will. But I wanted to say thank you, Dr. Horne, for coming on. I know that you kept it to about an hour time link that you were able to give me, so I just want to thank you for that. And hopefully I can have you back on to discuss one of the books that you actually you put on camera, which was the Counter-Revolution of 1836. I think it was your book on Texas. I'm just about finished with it, so I do have a lot of questions, but I'd like to save that for another time frame. I just want to say thank you for coming on, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Good luck to you.
Good luck to you as well. I'll be emailing you for the next episode if you're up for it.
Okay, don't forget to send the link to this one.
Okay, I won't. You have a good rest of your day.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
All right, everybody. That was Dr. Gerald Horne. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I know it was a little short. Again, I'll see you guys in the next one. Later.